I first met Jay at a bar on the edge of downtown. We were barely into 2009, and just that summer, the view had been condos flanked by cranes. Every month had afforded us a slightly different Austin skyline, its steady growth upward. But since Wall Street had blown itself up, and all of us with it, the view had frozen. The cranes must have been nomads, always at work, so in no need of a home. Now they posed by the buildings, 40 stories tall, but never moved. It felt like someone had hit the pause button on Austin, catching her in a particularly unflattering expression, and now all of us had to stare at the frozen screen for God knew how long. Still, for those of us who had grouched about the expensive condos and how the town didn't feel the same, like every aging generation and every revitalized American city, there was a perverse pleasure in this new view. We told you things don't work out this way. We told you progress is a sham. Later, when the subject came up in conversation, Jay told me my Gen X was showing. He insisted my generation's cynical worldview didn't give my glasses any more clarity than his generation's optimism. I thought at first he was exaggerating, needling me for being 6 years older than him, but he had pulled up proof on his laptop. He was indeed a millennial. This had bothered me more than it should have. The night we met was the evening of Obama's inauguration. I was finishing up my beer alone, left by a friend who had to get to her wait shift at the expensive steakhouse up the street. The bar's patio was small and there was no inside to speak of, so I watched a few groups circle, hoping to push me into leaving more quickly. I ignored them. But then this guy appeared at the other end of the picnic table, put his ridiculous wingtip sneaker up on the bench, and asked if he could sit. He was beautiful, even before he smiled at me. Though I would soon warm to his smile, in that first moment, he struck me as having an eminently punchable face. A pretty face, used to getting what it wanted. He was, I noted, on the short side. It should have made him even more insufferable, entitled beauty exacerbating a Napoleon complex. Later, I would grudgingly admit he had no Napoleon complex. He was fine with his height, just like he was fine with my age, fine with the skyline of my beloved city looking more and more like somewhere else.
In our veneration of John Graves and his iconic book, Goodbye to a River, his apostles often reach for the language of the divine. Graves becomes Saint Graves, his book, a sacred text. Revered as one of Texas' finest works of literature, Goodbye to a River famously chronicles, I skipped a line. His book, A Sacred Text. When he died in 2013, none other than the New York Times declared the author's canoe paddle a holy relic. Revered as one of Texas' finest works of literature, Goodbye to a River famously chronicles a 3-week canoe trip Graves took in November 1957 on the Brazos River. Flowing west of Fort Worth, Graves writes the Brazos loops and coils snakishly from Possum Kingdom Lake down through the Palo Pinto Mountains to the cedar dark limestone hills above a new lake called Whitney. Graves, then 37, had recently returned to his hometown, Fort Worth, to care for his ailing father. Blind in one eye from a grenade blast in the Pacific Theater, Graves had spent many years away from Texas, trying to follow in the footsteps of Ernest Hemingway. He published short stories and articles and had written a novel too bad to publish. When Graves learned of plans to build 5 dams between Possum Kingdom and Lake Whitney, drowning the stream.
When the cancer spread like thick sap through my Tío Tavo's body, and Ricky drove me and our mother to the ranch to kill quail for him, because we heard it would heal the sickness, I heard boom, 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 boom. And the 5 quail shot dead by Ricky's hand plopped on their sides. I sat on the green canvas swing tied to an old mesquite branch and listened to the echo of the gunshots. That was memory. Ricky slung his 12-gauge behind his shoulder and walked toward those big-bellied birds, work gloves on, held their twig legs between his fingers, and walked back to us with what seemed to be medicine. I thought of my Tío Tavo resting in his rock home by the river. I thought about how sick he must have felt, how many tears my mother's mother shed, and her daughter, and her granddaughter, and her grandson, all hunting for something. Ricky took the quail to the back of the truck. He plucked the feathers. He gutted their bellies, buried their warm insides into the dirt. It's okay if the coyotes find the intestines, he said, wiping the blood from his pocket knife onto his jeans. There's no water here anyway.
His smile was the first thing she noticed about Ian. One crooked tooth, a canine on the left, that made him appear slightly sinister. That drew her. It startled her that it did. Plus, he was so tanned even in December in the Austin bar where people played sand volleyball outside year-round because in Austin they could. Aussies, it was called, for fuck's sake. He was playing 2-on-2, and when his partner set him up for a spike, Ian seemed to stretch 4 more feet. Maddie was watching from a nearby table, her girlfriends chattering, as he leaped and arced like a gazelle, brought one skinny arm down. The pink and white volleyball hit a gap between the other team. The nearest opponent couldn't do anything but stretch one fist out to make desperate contact. Sand flew in his face, and he coughed, spit. Ian grinned, and though Maddie was still too far to see the crooked tooth, she caught something in his grin that spoiled it. Something like a mustached sneer, or the twirl of a black cape. When he went to the bar to get water, she met him there and offered to share a pitcher of beer. In her bed a few hours later, she wanted to bite that smile, but thought he might find it strange, so she settled for the corners of his lips, a scruffy patch on the left side of his chin. She sank her own teeth in. Her mother, a year and a half in the ground, hours away in a Hillcrest cemetery in Uvalde. Her father had remarried yesterday. Maddie had refused to attend and gotten lights out drunk on West 6th instead. She was nursing the hangover and the heartache when she met her girlfriends at Aussie's. Ian was 31, her own age, from Brisbane. He was visiting the US with mates after separating with his wife, and they wanted to cheer him up. They'd heard about Austin, of course. They wanted to try barbecue and breakfast tacos. Maddie laughed when she heard they'd stood in line for Franklin's, as all tourists did. She told him how her father could make brisket so tender it seemed to melt into the paper plate, with a bark black and crispy as mesquite crumbles. But when Ian said he'd gone to Torchy's for tacos, she made him get his ass up, pull his sweatpants on, and drove him an hour and a half south on 35, where she pulled onto a random exit on San Antonio's south side, and drove until she found any taqueria sign. It took 2 minutes. He ate 4. Chorizo and egg, sausage and egg, bean and cheese, and nopalito and egg. She had barbacoa with a big red and let him taste them both. He nearly wept. She did too, remembering her younger sister Hannah gulping Big Red in high school like it was going extinct. Their mother spitting it out the first time they had her try it. The 3 of them taking turns to spit out Big Red the farthest and laughing. It should have been a fling, Maddie knew. It had all the makings of it. Ian was passing through. He was lonely and vulnerable. And though she denied it at the time, she was too. When his friends went on to Marfa and Big Bend, he stayed in Austin with her. She was on winter break, school not back until early January. She drove him to Fredericksburg, to Enchanted Rock, to Lockhart to try her favorite barbecue after the Maldonado men's. They made love like teenagers, like they couldn't get enough contact. Skin to skin was still too much of a barrier. He held her in a way she didn't think she'd wanted to be held. He cradled her and she felt cherished. "This is something," he whispered to her once as she lay beside him. He lifted her face and framed it between his palms, not calloused but smooth, the hands of an Australian businessman, not a Texas roughneck or a ball player or a man trying to live up to any kind of notion of a man. "This is real," he said. The words "I love you" caught in her throat, but she strangled them there. She booked a plane ticket with him the next day, 2 weeks in Australia. She called in for a sub the first week of classes and followed him, already knowing how this would end, how it must. She felt the drawing clouds, something she and her mother had always had in common, the pessimism. If it can go wrong, it will. It will. Thank you.
There are those who skip over introductions. As for them, we're done here. There are others who hate them, but read them anyway. As for you, I'm sorry. But there are some, maybe plenty, who like to get their feet planted on the ground outside the entrance to the shadowed forest before entering. For you, I'll give it my best shot. I'll write the introduction to this book several times over, writing about sad endings that lead to unexpected beginnings down a life road you never thought you'd have to travel can be difficult when you don't want to hurt anyone, especially when it comes to those involved in the sad endings. But truth withheld leaves a hole in a story that any sensible reader would walk away from. And I say truth because facts are always suspect. That's the area where the writer and the ones being written about disagree the most. Another truth, though, is that if writers ever allowed this conundrum to stop them, no good stories would ever get written. It's important to note that I'm writing the introduction to The Broken Summer in the autumn that followed it. Things are different now, as they will be again in the coming winter. That's the nature of mythopoetic journeys. That's why you'll notice a shift in tone when the lights go out in the summer's story. To be blunt, I was much sadder and more broken at the beginning of the ending that begins this odyssey. This brings me to another important point. This book and the three that will follow is not a travel memoir. A journey is quite a different thing. Take Odysseus. His epic voyage dealt with the question and problem of home as much as it did masts, sails, mysterious islands, and one-eyed monsters. Homer wasn't writing a travel guide to the Mediterranean. His protagonist spent 7 years trapped on a lush island with a goddess and a never-ending itch to leave. It's not a good suggestion for sightseers. So I'll spend certain amounts of time stuck in things like the doldrums and places I may or may not want to be. And when I am at sea, I'm not visiting the Santuario de Chimayo or vacationing in Telluride. I'm riding out storms and fighting demons within and without, and I desperately want to find my way home, even if it's only to myself. Because it turns out for me, there is no Ithaca anymore.
Please give it up for Stacey Swann, Wes Ferguson.